Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel here in Halls of Torment. So today we're going to do a stats guide. This is going to be a little bit more new player focused, but if you're a veteran, you might find something interesting in here as well. We're going to go over as much as possible. We're going to be pretty in-depth here, so I'll put some timestamps down below. To get started though, I did want to maybe just show you guys something interesting that you might not have ever noticed before. So there is this artifact over here, Apocryphal Curse. It's supposed to increase the negative modifiers. Now, it has a secondary effect. What it actually does on the player will increase our base damage gains by 20%. I think it's a bug, but you can totally take advantage of it in your run. So let's go into a run and we'll start off with base damage stuff. So we're here in a run. This is the Holy Scepter, the main weapon of the Cleric. So as you can see, we have the white base damage number displayed here, and then we have a green total. So this base damage number will never change in the menu. In the menu here, it'll always be the same. And of course, we can manipulate it to get a higher total base damage and multiplier value. So what the game does, it'll take this base value that we have here, then it'll add any additional base value we get. So right now we have some extra coming from this ring. If we unequip the ring and we come back down here, we can have a look. We no longer have the additional base value, and our total has gone down. If we put it back on, we come back over here, and we got plus 36, and then we got 7,100 because we have all this extra multiplier. So that's how the base damage stuff works in this game. You have the base value here, any additional base goes on, and then any percentage multiplier is then multiplied on top of that. So 100% is an extra 1 multiplier. So you can see I got Shrine of Blessing, some Torment Shards, Scales of Pain, the Jeweler's Spark, and the Warchief's Visor. We just quickly level up on this character. It doesn't really matter what we take. If we come back here into the menu, this character also gets extra base damage on level up. As you can see, we've got an additional plus 6 now. So we've got the plus 42. And then we got the extra multiplier. So it'll slowly increase on this character as we go. Now, worth noting that this particular base damage on the Holy Scepter is pretty high as it is, so adding an additional plus 30 is actually not really a great use of an item here. As you can see, if we take this off, the total damage only decreases by, what was it, about 200. So, you know, it is adding a little bit extra, but it's not that great. Now, it is much better for some of the other abilities in the game here. Have a look at Transfixion. This is the other one we've taken. Our base damages over here, we have 100 at base, and then we get plus 36. So adding plus 36 to 100 is significantly more powerful than adding plus 36 to 1000. As you can see, it's like literally 10 times more potent on there. So when you're running lower base damage abilities or main weapons, you might want to consider adding a base damage ring. It's really quite powerful. Let's talk about critical chance. So the way this works in Halls of Torment is kind of interesting. We have our base critical value here. Any base values are added onto this, and then we use our total multiplier to get our total crit value. Now, if our crit chance is sitting at 100%, every single strike we do will crit and do the crit bonus damage, so 230% in this example. If you get it over 100%, what it'll do is, let's say it's sitting at, let's go over here to Transfixion. Let's say it's sitting at 125%. So it'll guarantee to roll a critical hit, and then there'll be an additional 25% chance for a free critical hit to land. So we can get an additional crit out of this. So if we're sitting at 200% crit chance, every single attack will double crit. If we're sitting at 300, it'll triple crit. So you can stack up some really huge damage using the critical strike chance in this game. So crit damage works in much the same way. It starts at 100% at base on a lot of the abilities here, which is nice. Or it might be even a bit higher on some. Let's have a look at our main weapon. The crit strike is 100 at base here, but so obviously stacking this up as high as you possibly can get throughout a run is really nice. An item like this is really good for the mid to late game. I mean, it's pretty nice early game too, but early game you're probably going to need to move around and set yourself up quite a bit before you can really take advantage of it. But standing still for 15 seconds gives you 50% crit chance and crit bonus. It's a great item. It's not necessarily the best chess piece because you might want to run something like Defiant Plate depending on what you're doing, but either one of these two, this one for DPS, Defiant Plate for, you know, survivability. So crit chance and crit damage are relatively straightforward. You want to get your crit chance up over 100% where you can. If you can stack it up even higher with an item like this, it's great. And then you want to stack up a bunch of crit bonus to take advantage of all that extra crit chance you're doing. Of course, adding something like Multistrike and attack speed on top of that is going to be really, really nice. We'll talk about those here in a second. Okay, let's talk about block here. Block is an interesting stat, especially early game. I think early game, it's worth taking some block. I think as you go throughout your runs, it's worth at least taking the base block from the level ups. But depending on which character you're running, what sort of build you're running, block might synergize pretty well with it. For example, on the Shield Maiden, has some pretty interesting things she can do with block. Not all characters will really benefit from speccing super hard into block. And you really do have to spec pretty hard into it to actually block 100% of the incoming damage. In fact, it's pretty tricky to even pull that off. There is a build on the Shield Maiden you can do, but it's kind of difficult. With that being said, having a base level throughout your runs is pretty nice. The what we're getting in our build right now is coming from the plated boots. This is a great item to have if you're not sure what to put in your boot slot. This is just a great go-to defensive item, plus 10 base defense and plus 10 base block. And we're getting some extra value from the Shrine of Blessing stuff there. So if you have a look down, the 100% block chance for 6 damage, 22 damage is 50%, and 55 damage is a 20%. So not super high values at our current 22 right here, but having at least 20 to 30 block in your runs can be nice. Just depending what your setup is, I think if you're going to run plated boots, it's pretty obvious just to run this, and you don't really worry too much more about taking block. As I said, maybe you can take the level up block, base value points. But aside from that, I think defense is the better stat to invest in, as it just gives you straight up damage reduction, and it's just way more powerful. Really want to aim for around that 100 total mark in the current patch in your runs as you're going up higher level. At the lower level, you probably don't need quite that much. About 50 to 70 is probably going to be enough to really get that damage reduction up to closer to that 70% kind of range. As you can see, at 50, we've got a 54% damage reduction. A lot of that is coming from our Defiant Plate in this particular scenario. We got Thick Hide trait, we got Plated Boots, and then we got Defiant Plate. This thing is really great, a really great item. Gives us base defense, base regeneration. It is incredibly powerful. I do recommend, especially if you can net a purple version of this during your runs, this is going to absolutely carry you defensively. It's a really strong item. Any more defense you can stack on top, though, is really powerful. So now I've currently got Warchief's Visor equipped. One of the other items that I do recommend is the Defensive Hood. It gives you defense and movement speed, which is really nice. Really great combination. If you are going to go for a more offensive build, though, something like Warchief's Visor is really nice, just to stack up extra damage and force as you go. We'll get into the force stat, as that one is a little bit more complicated in a little bit, but Mark of the Grenadier, one of the best marks to use on any character, as it enables you to take big 20% defense increases on your proficient stance level up. So I highly recommend using this if you're struggling to stay alive. Use Mark of the Grenadier. It is not the only one you can use, of course. Something like the Mark of Sanctity for extra regeneration is pretty nice. And the Shield Maiden's Mark does give you access to a lot of block and defense as well. So that one is also an option. But just for general play, if you're wanting to boost up your defense and survivability a lot easier, equip Mark of the Grenadier, take the proficient stance, level up. So it also gives you access to more movement speed and more regeneration, which is just really good. And you get the extra grenades when you're damaging foes with the projectiles. And little grenades are they're just really good for extra damage output. It's just a fantastic mark to have on any character, really for any run. As I said, it's not the only one you can use, but it is the one I recommend for newer players if you're not really too sure what to run on your build. Take this one and take the proficient stance. The 20% defense increases. You can even duplicate them with your potions for more defensive goodness. If you can get this stacked up over 100, it's really nice. If you can get it up over 120 to 150 range in the current patch, you're basically unkillable. Aside from the super high torment, final bosses or whatever. But So the way defense works is quite similar. It can increase the base values, and then we add on the extra multiplier. So we can get extra multiplier comes from Mark of the Grenadier on this particular setup. That's why we've gone pretty hard for the base increases on these. And as you can see, I've also got the thick hide, which I've taken there already. So we stack up our base value, and then we get as much multiplier stacked on top of that as we can to get the total value up as high as we can. On this particular setup, you can get it relatively high with the Mark of the Grenadier, but the Cleric does not have the greatest defensive values, only getting +2 on the thick hide level ups. We'll get into some more character-specific stuff in a little bit, but for now, I do recommend trying to get up to at least 70 or so defense in your runs. If you can get it up a bit higher, you're going to be even safer, but at least to that 70% damage reduction. If you can get it closer to 80-85%, you're going to be really, really safe, but that's a lot harder to hit now. So yeah, trying to aim for 70 or so total base defense, base damage reduction there. Going to be a really, really nice place for your runs. Health and regeneration is, I mean, these are pretty straightforward values. Again, you take the max health and then you can pump tons of percentage in with your extra shards. If you want to just dump, 100, 200 shards into max HP and become really tanky, you can totally do that in this game. And then you can take the level ups. Let's say your level up gives you 40 base defense, and then you have, your extra 1.75 multiplier on top of that. So you end up getting quite a good chunk of extra total base HP out of taking the level ups if you have some Torment Shards in there. Base regeneration is interesting. You're seeing the +6 from the Defiant Plate. One of the reasons this is such a powerful item, it also gives you extra regeneration to work with, which is really, really nice. And we're up a +6 already, you know what I'm saying? So, and then we also get a level up value from the character and the Shrine of Blessing there as well. The regeneration in general, it just depends a little bit more what setup you have and what character you're running. This is the thing. You're going to have some way of healing yourself in this game, right? So, if you are going to spec into regeneration, you need to get it up over 10 at the very least. In the sort of mid to late game, you're going to want it up over 20. Earlier game, maybe you can get away with it if you're up closer to 5 or so, just depending on what you're doing. If you have Defiant Plate, early game, this thing can totally carry you, especially if you have the green passive version here. Just so many extra stats out of it. So this combination here is just so good at keeping you alive. Doesn't really matter what character you're on or what sort of mission you're running. Bloodstained Wrappings, this thing will heal you. The way the Bloodstained Wrappings work, if you're unfamiliar, is it charges when we're dealing damage, and then when we get hit, it'll heal us based on the charges. So the more damage we deal, the more it heals us back. And the Defiant Plate, we've sort of gone over it already, but the more you take damage, the more you can stack up defense and regeneration. This combination is just so good at keeping you alive throughout your runs. If you're unsure what to do to try and stay alive as you're going higher up, I mean, this really is the combination. You put on some defensive boots. It's really, really powerful. If you have a Duelist Spark, I recommend speccing into it and leveling it up. As you can see, mine is pretty high level, so it's going to take you a while to get up to that sort of rate, so don't worry about that. But getting it up closer to 100% or something is not too bad. It's going to take you a little bit, but it'll stack up between runs, and it'll just keep increasing the more and more you use it. And the stats do transfer to the green and purple variant, so it is really one of the best items in the necklace slot here. There are some other interesting choices that we can go over a bit later for stats purposes, but for straight damage or stuff like force and area and stuff like that, stacking the Duelist Spark is just fantastic. One of the other items that's interesting in this particular patch is this Holy Relic that spews out these power-ups. So not only does it heal you a little bit, starts your regeneration, but it also drops power-ups. So you can sort of save these, stack them up for the boss fights, and make the boss fights really kind of trivial using this thing. So it's also one that you might want to consider using. Let's talk about movement speed next here. Movement speed is kind of an interesting stat in this game. It's generally speaking pretty straightforward. The faster your movement speed, the faster your character goes. This is a good, reliable item to use. The hood that gives you plus base defense and plus 20% movement speed. Very safe item to use. Not necessarily the item you want to use on every single run, but Now, the where movement speed can get a little bit confusing is when we're using the confusing lens. But before we go into that, there are some other options that you can use. Something like running shoes, something like the guiding star rings are kind of interesting. You can trade off attack speed for movement speed while you're moving around or standing still. They're kind of interesting. I don't necessarily recommend using them. I think there are better things to use in your boot slot than the running shoes. I think the hood is a great, just safe item to use if you want some more movement speed and survivability all in one. I'll just go and equip the confusing lens and just show you something here though. So the confusing lens is this artifact here, minus 10 meters per second base movement speed to all. So this is generally speaking not really what you want to use during your runs. Now, if we have a look with the confusing lens on, we're sitting at a negative 6.02. So this thing will basically make your controls go backwards. It's kind of a bit confusing to work with if you've never used it before. There are some ways to get around that. You can use the API in Steam if you're on a controller, or you can mess around with the configurations in here if you're on PC. But the one thing that you really have to note is that if you are going to run the confusing lens, you can only focus on percentage-based movement speed. If you take any additive movement speed, it will make you slower. So what do I mean by this? Since we're sitting at -6 right now, let's just say we took +1 meters per second. That'll actually make us go and sit at -5, which is actually going to make us slower. So the confusing lens is a little bit annoying. If you are going to run higher Torment though, the takeaway is that you just need to focus on percentage-based movement speed. You don't need to focus on taking any base movement speed. And once you stick to that sort of rule, it's not actually too bad to use a confusing lens. Just mess around with the API or the controller configurations and go from there. It's not too bad. Generally speaking, though, in the early game, you want to just be faster than the enemies so you can dodge them and avoid the damage. Later on in the game, you're going to be able to get some pretty high regeneration and healing stuff going that you don't necessarily have to dodge every single attack. It is still nice to have enough movement speed to be able to get away, especially at the max Torment. You do need enough that you can sort of get away from the enemies a little bit, but in general gameplay, movement speed is more of a preference sort of thing. At a certain point, you don't really need more than, I don't know, like 8 meters a second or something. It feels pretty fast in this game. You really don't need much more than that, but you know what? Have fun with it and go crazy. Let's talk about attack speed next, because this is actually a really important stat. You can stack up all the damage in the world, but if you're attacking really, really slow, you're still not really going to get anywhere. You have a look over here. The guiding star in this particular instance is providing us with an additional 105% attack speed, which is actually pretty good. It's pretty strong. It's one reason you might want to consider using these items in particular. Attack speed in general, though, I mean, the more the better, right? It is one stat that's powerful enough that I would consider using either memory or duplication tinctures on during your runs to just get more of it. In the really early game, the attack speed gloves are actually really, really powerful. Later on, you're probably going to want to use the wrappings instead, but getting extra 60% attack speed, or what is it, 30% with the white ones is really, really valuable early game. So I would take that. Later on, you can get the purple Jeweler's Spark to show up, which can give you some insane attack speed. So if you are a little bit later on into the game and you have leveled up your Jeweler's Spark, it's another reason that you want to invest into one of these things. It can provide you with some pretty insane attack speed increase. I think mine is, I don't know, up over 200% somewhere. I can't exactly remember, but it's pretty crazy. It's absolutely worth investing into attack speed throughout your runs. Now, Multistrike is also an interesting stat in this game. Basically, if our Multistrike is set to 1, nothing will happen. Our Multistrike here being 1.3, so what happens here is every time we attack, you can just imagine an additional bar filling up by 30% every time we attack. And every time it rolls over, we're going to land an additional free attack. So sitting at 30% makes it a little bit awkward. If we're exactly at 33.3, then it'd be every 3 attacks exactly. As you can see down there, it says every 3 to 4 attacks. So if you're able to get your multi-strike up to 2, then every single attack you're doing will be a double hit, which is pretty nice. So A multi-strike, again, another one of these stats that the more of it you can get, the merrier. Again, it's a little bit harder to get multi-strike. There are a couple of different ways that we can get multi-strike, but just taking it through your level up traits is just an easy way to get multi-strike as you go. So range and area in this game are relatively straightforward. Range is the distance way that you can attack, and area is the size of your attack. So if you have any AoE, stacking area in this game is really fun. Again, you can get the green Duelist Spark, which stacks up area, which is really, really nice. Actually, one of my favorite items to use in runs, because it's just fun. It makes everything really, really big. It's super satisfying to use. You stack on, some attack speed and stuff on top of that. It's just really, really fun. These stats are relatively straightforward. I mean, range is literally the range of, the distance away that your attack can land. And the area is literally the size. Maybe the scepter isn't necessarily the best to show the area on that one. This one's got cone cone size there too, because his is actually a cone as well. We'll just go over some of the miscellaneous stats in the game. Agony fill rate is the rate in which the agony mode will increase. This is increased by one of the artifacts called the Restless Wheel. Chest drop and ability drop are pretty obvious ability. Tomes are the things that give you the abilities. Chests are chests. Base ability slots are here. There is another artifact that can decrease that. Pickup range is the ring. You'll see the distance within. You can pick up the gems. And experience gain is an additional experience multiplier there. It's pretty basic stats here in the game. Let's talk about stats and Torment Shards here for a second. As you can see, my cleric's currently at level 250. I've got a spread of 50 across 4 different stats here. As you can see, each stat will have a different percentage value increase for each shard you put in. As you can have a look, I need to put 5 shards in to get a single percentage point of regeneration. However, max health, I only need 1 shard. So you actually get far more value for things like max health, damage, force. These 3 in particular, you get a 1-to-1 ratio, which is fantastic. Something like crit chance and crit bonus, you get a 2-to-1 ratio. So you'll need to put 2 points in here to get 1% out of it. So I still do recommend crit chance and crit bonus. I think they're really, really powerful stats. And 2-to-1 is not too bad. As you can see, some of the stats in here, though, are a 5-to-1 ratio. Something like Regeneration, or down here with attack speed, Multistrike. Now, these 2 stats, I think, are pretty powerful. So having a 5-to-1 ratio does sort of make a bit more sense. If you had 1-to-1 ratio with something like attack speed, man, you could just go pretty insane. So I can understand that. Area, I don't know. Maybe it does make sense because stacking up area really, really high in this game is pretty powerful as well. Regeneration, I think, maybe is the one that could be a little bit more lenient. Maybe they could buff it a little bit. Having a 5-to-1 ratio here for regen it doesn't feel that potent later on in the game. Early game, maybe, but by the time you stack up enough shards to actually get this stat up, it doesn't feel like you're rewarded for really investing too hard into it. I think early game, you just want to stack them into damage, unless you're really struggling to stay alive. You can put a few points into max HP, but I think just stacking damage 1-to-1 value early game is just going to be really, really nice over here. Then getting your crit chance and a little bit of extra max HP is going to be nice. Getting your crit chance up above 100% for all your abilities that you're using throughout your runs is going to be really nice. And then you can use the extra rings to start stacking up extra crit damage and crit bonus. Now, effect damage, unfortunately, currently in the current patch is not that great. I don't necessarily recommend running it. Even if you put like 500% into here, the effect builds, they're just not that strong. It just is what it is. That's currently how the game is balanced. Maybe in future this will be more valuable. Right now it's a 2-to-1, so you know what, you can try some effect builds. At low torment you can get away with it, but if you go and try and push high torment with these effect kind of builds, they're pretty weak. It is what it is. Let's talk about these 2 quickly. Fragile and Affliction. These are debuffs our character can dish out to the enemies. Fragile, each stack will increase the damage dealt by 5% for direct attacks, and Affliction is 5% for damage over time attacks. So They're interesting stats. I think Fragile is worth going into on some builds. Affliction, you know, I don't know, direct damage in particular is quite powerful, so I would recommend more going into Fragile than Affliction. If you want to go hard into an Affliction build, you can do that, and it helps with some of the damage over time effects, but it's really not very strong in the current game. So let's talk about this force stat. You can think about this like a wild card kind of stat. Does something different for each ability and each main weapon in the game. As you can see, I'm still on the cleric. Down here, it gives the cleric's main ability a knockback. So depending on what ability you're using and which character you're on, this could be a dead stat or it could be a completely amazing stat. So something interesting is it also gives you knockback on the Radiant Aura. So if you stack this up high enough, the Aura can become kind of hilarious to use, bouncing the enemies around everywhere. Unfortunately, the Aura just doesn't do that much damage, even though it says 20k. It does spread its damage out across all of the enemies. So depending on what ability you're running, Force can be a really good stat. It can be kind of a dead stat. It can be, I don't know, more of a comical stat, or it can be something kind of out of control, like here on the Morning Star. Force increases our damage, giving us just a total damage multiplier here. The higher we stack up the Force, the higher the multiplier will be. You can see we're already at 2.43 here. And I think I'm only, level 10 or something in this particular run that we're in here. Also increases the max duration of these things. Not that you need it, but you know what? Put it on there as well. 9.72 seconds at base here. Not too bad. That's one of the reasons that we like running the War Chief's Visor. Now, you can run the one that also increases damage as well as Force. Either one, both of them are pretty good. So the other two abilities to call out here that work really well with Force are Ring Blades and Arcane Splinters as well. Both of them stack duration on Force, so they stay out on the field for a very long time if you Force stack pretty hard. The Force stat can be good or bad depending on what you're doing. I think if you are going to go for high damage on a run with something like Morningstar Ring Blades, it is an obvious choice. If you're going to take a bunch of different skills with like magic damage or something like that, maybe that's not the one you want to go. I want to just also highlight here Mark of Rituals. Here at level 60, there's a trait you can take if you equip this thing that increases your base force and force percentage by a good amount. You can use a duplication tincture on that to make your force kind of go out of control. It's very, very powerful. While we're in here, let's go over the marks. So the one I recommended earlier in the video is Mark of the Grenadier. This thing is great if you want to increase your defense. Also has access to a good amount of regeneration and extra movement speed, 10% as well. Also gives you the grenade. So this thing is really, really powerful, really, really strong overall. Mark of Knowledge is really interesting. Sage has some XP traits as well as pickup range sort of stuff. If you want to do a super high level run or get your level up as high as possible, you can take Mark of Knowledge and take a bunch of the XP traits and duplicate them. That's pretty fun. Not necessarily what I recommend, but it's fun to mess around with. The Mark of the Beast is interesting. Taking the dog for a walk. I mean, the dog is an interesting... it's more of a gimmick. I don't really recommend using it that much. I don't know. Tell me if you guys enjoy taking the Hound for a walk. Not really my favorite one. We did a bit of a gimmick Christmas video using that. Actually, that was kind of fun, but... So these two I don't really recommend, Mark of the Sparks and Mark of the North, unless you really want to go specifically hard into Frost and or Spark stuff. Then obviously you can use them. I went over the Mark of the Rituals before. There is a really powerful Force trait in there. Mark of Sanctity has a very, very powerful Regeneration trait. Mark of the Shield has the block stuff as well as some defense. It is a pretty good one to take as well. I do think Mark of the Grenadier is probably better for defense overall. Mark of Incineration, I really don't recommend taking this one. I don't think it synergizes very well. You can take it on the Incinerator, but Mark of the Arrow is good for movement speed, and the base crit chance here is really nice. And then we have Mark of the Sword, base damage and base defense. A very, very safe early game choice, and pretty good late into the late game. Extra base defense and base damage is pretty good, but I think overall this one is the best for defense. If you want to go some regeneration shenanigans, Mark of the Sanctity is really good. If you want to do some crazy stuff with Force, Mark of the Rituals is an interesting choice. If you want to go anything to do with movement, speed, Mark of the Arrow is really, really nice. This one also has extra base health. If you want to do crazy health stacking builds, Mark of the Sword is also really, really good for that. So we do actually have some pretty good choices in our mark selection there. All right, let's go over damage categories next. So every single different ability and character in the game has a bunch of different damage categories associated with it. As if we have a look over here, Hunting Spear is a physical projectile. The Hound is physical, melee, and summon. Over here, we have physical melee for both of the Warhammer and the Shield Bash. Physical projectile for the Aquabus. We have magic area and projectile for the grenades, so on and so forth. So you can have a look through all of the different characters, all of the abilities in the game, and you can see that they will be associated with a certain grouping. So it's important when you're stacking up your damage throughout a run to take a bunch of the abilities that sort of align with the damage type that you're speccing into. For example, here on the cleric that we've been talking about throughout this video, the main attack is magic and melee. So it makes sense to go into magic and or melee stuff with this character. There are a few in particular that work particularly well. There are some magic and melee abilities. There is also the Spirit Warrior, which is one of my favorite abilities personally. It's really fun to use. And then stuff like the Splinters and Magic Aura. So you can stack all that stuff together and do a magic build, for example, on the Cleric. It's not the only way you can run the Cleric. Of course, you can take physical abilities or other abilities and just stack, flat damage and crit and that sort of stuff instead. That also works. Or you can lean a little bit more into what this character has to offer and go into damage, regeneration, and go hard into the Holy Scepter. So go main weapon attack, attack speed damage, and all that sort of stuff as well. So the takeaway here is that each ability in the game will have a few different damage types associated with it, and if you're going to build into it, it makes sense to really spec into the same damage type associated with the ability that you're using. If you take, for example, a bunch of physical abilities and then you spec up heaps into magic damage, it's not really going to work. It's going to kind of be a mismatch. Make much more sense to go hard into magic damage and then take a magic ability. So it's relatively straightforward, but it's important to note each ability has a few different types. So just pay attention to those as you're doing your runs and speccing your character. Let's talk about some character stuff now, and the Swordsman is up first. So Swordsman has good base health and defense. Gets extra damage and range and area on its main weapon as it's leveling, as well as extra health and damage percentage. So very much focused on staying healthy. Has pretty good base defense and can scale up its defense all right with its traits. Later on into the end game, you might want to consider throwing some extra defense on there through the mark and the items that you're wearing. But early game, you probably don't need too much extra defense. Scales up base health really, really well. The strongest character for scaling base health. A lot of that is due to the mark that we talked about earlier, though. So you can actually put the mark on the other characters to get the level 60, trait. But scales up its earlier level traits much better for base HP than most of the other characters. Its main ability is physical and melee. You can do some really, really fun physical abilities, or physical builds, I should say, with this character. I really like stacking area and physical damage and just taking a bunch of physical abilities and just going crazy. Putting on an echoing band and just watching everything explode is a lot of fun. Let's talk about the Warlock next. So Warlock has some pretty decent health, but has really, really bad base defense, block strength, and regeneration. There's actually a pretty weak character, especially if you try and take it into the late game without any extra defensive items. You're going to get absolutely destroyed. On each level up, we get base summons for our main weapon, as well as force and health. So, as I said, has some decent health scaling, but because of the low defense and block strength scaling on this character, we are pretty squishy. We're going to have to spec this character out in some defensive stuff like the Defiant Plate, as we were talking about earlier, as well as probably even more, maybe even the defensive hood on this character as well. Although this character does enjoy doing some force stacking shenanigans, but it's probably not my favorite character for that sort of loadout anyway. What I think you want to do on this character is really spec into the summons. Put on the Shepherd's Boon necklace. Take as many summons as you can. Take the orbs and just get your regeneration up as high as possible. Take some defensive stats, of course, along the way, but that's the most fun way to play this character, in my opinion. Exterminator is an interesting character. Does get some defense scaling, which does make it an interesting character. Right now in the game, though, burn and just effect damage in general is not that good compared to a lot of the other builds. Now, if you've got an early game build that you're really enjoying using Exterminator, go for it. You know what I mean? It's not a terrible character and it has some decent defense scaling. So you can make it work, but it's not really my personal favorite character to run. And I think the effect damage builds as you go later on into the end game, they just feel weaker and weaker. And that's kind of unfortunate for some of these characters. Some of the characters over here that we're going to get into in a second. So the Sage is a very unique character, also very, very weak. Base health, defense, block strength, and regeneration is all very, very low. The scaling on the character is very low. But we do get extra pickup range and damage at 1% each while we're scaling. And we get to select an ability at the beginning of the round to use as our main weapon for the character. So the character is unique in that way, but has very, very low stats to start with. So, man, you are pretty squishy on this character. You need a lot of extra defensive stuff and regeneration and health to get anywhere with this character if you're going to put up against high torment. If you go sort of low to medium torment, this character can be an absolute powerhouse, can be pretty fun to use. The choice really is yours when you're using the Sage. Do you want to take a fun ability like Morningstar and kind of spec hard into the force and damage and go that route? Do you want to go, I don't know, movement speed? Do you want to take some dash impact on the warrior? I don't know, depending on what you want to do. The Sage is a very versatile character in that way. You can make the main ability the main star of the run. So it is pretty fun to use. Experiment and see what you like to use on the Sage. The Sorceress is another interesting character here. We got a pretty fast movement speed character that scales up block strength and spark damage. Also, we get extra base damage and crit chance on our main ability as we're leveling. Gets pretty good movement speed scaling and block strength, which is interesting. Pretty low defense and base health on this character, so kind of squishy. You can take advantage of the block early game. Late game, you're definitely going to want to take defense as well to try and stay alive here. Again, Spark is just not the... I don't know, it's probably the weakest of the three. I don't know, Spark in particular sort of tends to crash my system as well if I'm pushing it as hard as it can go. The effects just kind of crash the game. There are some fun Spark builds you can do, don't get me wrong. You can go pretty hard into lightning and elemental damage on this character. You can take the arcane splinters and turn them elemental as well. On this character can be pretty fun. It's a pretty fun combo. I've got a build on the channel where we did that with the thunder helmet. What's it called? The lightning crown helmet. It's pretty fun. So the Norseman down here is probably the best at applying elemental debuffs because of the way the main weapon, the dual axes, work. So he has a really fast attack speed, low base damage, so it can apply the elemental debuffs really, really quickly, especially if we're dealing with frost. So he gets extra frost damage and regeneration as he's leveling up with the base damage and area of his dual axes increasing as well. Norseman also gets pretty good health, defense, and regeneration, and pretty decent movement speed as well. He's actually kind of stacked in terms of his base stats. As I said, I think he's probably the strongest of the main elemental attackers down here. His specialty is frost. Let's go over here to the Beast Huntress. So Beast Huntress is kind of an all-round character, I guess. It's got movement speed and damage. We're going to get base damage and multi-strike for our Spear and Hound as we're leveling up. Kind of a mix of base stats across the board here. Health at 400, 5, 5, and 1. So it's pretty standard across the board for this character over here. This character's gimmick is that she has a hound and a hunting spear. I don't know, you can do kind of anything you want here. You can go physical, you can go melee, you can go summon. Or you can even go projectile over here if you really want to. I think just going physical damage on this character makes a lot of sense. We go over here to the Shield Maiden. So one of the better defensive characters in the game, gets a lot of block strength, gets a good amount of health and defense as well. A bit slower, but also gets good amount of regeneration. It's area and block scaling as we level up. So this character not necessarily feeling the strongest early game, but as you get later on into the game, man, you can get some very, very tanky builds happening with this character in particular. So the Archer is a fast character, has decent defense and health, nothing too crazy, but has some decent regeneration, moves around really fast, has movement speed, crit chance, scaling as it levels, and base damage and piercing for the bow as well, which is really nice. The bow is a pretty wide ranged attack, so yeah, it's pretty good. Having extra crit chance as you're scaling up is really, really nice. Kind of spiking your DPS the further you can get into a run. With this character, it really makes sense to go with physical and projectile stuff, though, as it really synergizes with the bow really, really well. Stack up a bunch of projectiles and just go to town on this character. It's pretty fun. Landy over here, probably one of the best defensive characters for late game. Gets extra defense, scaling, crit bonus as we level up. Gets pretty decent base stats. They don't look that crazy on paper here, but because Landy gets the crazy defense level ups through the proficient stance, you're able to do some pretty crazy things. You can do physical, projectile. You can even go hard into the grenades on this character if you want. Go magic area and all that sort of stuff. So pretty fun character, pretty versatile type of character. Lastly, we have the Cleric over here. Gets damage and regeneration as we're scaling up. In fact, is the strongest character in terms of base regeneration in the game. We get some pretty crazy regeneration stuff happening on this character. It's pretty fun. Has pretty good base stats overall. Doesn't scale up to defense quite as nicely as some of the other characters here, but has some pretty good starting stats, has pretty good regeneration, and scales up magic damage pretty well. You can do some pretty fun magic builds on this character. Now, it's worth pointing out that on any of the characters here, you can take any of the abilities and do whatever you really want. You don't necessarily have to lean into what they're doing. Like, you don't have to go magic damage on the Cleric, for example. Okay, so let's also go over some of the items that can really help us stack up stats in this game. I think it's worth pointing out Warchief's Visor can help us stack up both force and damage, and it's based just passively on the damage that we deal. So this thing will just quietly stack up in the background. It's really, really good. Force and damage together. There is also one that is just force, and we have some purple options that are really, really strong as well for both force and damage. So keep your eye out for Warchief's Visor. In terms of base defense and regeneration, the Hood is just an amazing item. It always will be. It gives us base movement speed and base defense. It's a great item. So the Duelist Spark, the white one here, is really powerful by itself, but we also have some really fantastic options. We have area, we have force. You can get some pretty crazy force stacking going with this thing. Also, we have the access to the purple ones throughout the run, which are attack speed and crit chance and crit damage, which are just fantastic as well. It's a really, really, really strong item. In terms of the rings, we do have a few different options. I like taking in crit chance and crit bonus because I just like stacking up the DPS on these particular items. The other one you might want to keep your eye out for is actually the duality ring here. This thing can actually keep you alive. And for high torment stuff, the power-ups can be really, really strong. So you might want to sub this in for one of these if you're really struggling to stay alive. But I think this combination down here is going to keep you alive on most of your runs. We have Bloodstained Wrappings, easily best in slot item for the hands here. There are some other nice gloves that exist within the game, but when you have something that can heal you this much, it kind of pales in comparison. You know, everything else kind of pales in comparison. You've got the attack speed gloves, which are nice. The Thorn Fists are really nice for running the Vault in particular. Aside from that, the Bloodstained Wrappings really are best in slot. Again, Defiant Plate is the best defensive item in the game, I would say, aside from perhaps this. This is the other item that can totally keep you alive. It can stack up an insane amount of base defense and base regeneration, especially if we can land the purple one. We'll try and get the purple version of this to drop for us as well. And the plated boots, I think they're just easily the best in slot item now. Plus 10 base defense and base block in the boot slot here is really nice. You can take some extra defense or do some shenanigans with some of these other items for fun if you want. But if we're talking about best in slot item, The plated boots for most of your endgame builds is going to be probably the best item you can put in there. I just want to go over one more thing with block here before we end the video. So the way the block chance works, when your block strength is 4 times greater than the incoming damage, you have a 100% chance to block. So that's where that 8 value is coming from. Got a 50% chance when block strength equals the incoming damage. That's the 30 number there. And 20% chance when block strength is 2.5 less than the incoming damage. That's the 75 number you see there. So that's taken from the Halls of Wiki. It's not really explained super well in game, but if you're unclear, that's how it works. And when the block is successful, you negate all incoming damage. So that's how block works. I just wanted to clarify that, as we didn't quite go over the mechanics earlier in the video. So, all right, guys, this one ended up being a long video. So if you found anything useful at all, smash subscribe to help our channel grow. If there's anything else you think we missed or that you would like to go further in depth on, let me know with a comment down below and we can cover that in a future video. With that, though, I hope you all have a fantastic, amazing day wherever you are. Take it easy.